CARICOM stakeholders have been meeting and crafting a regional approach on migration policy. It comes at a crucial time for the Caribbean region, given what is happening in Venezuela, the exodus in Haiti, and its ripple effects on Caribbean nations across the region. And of course, looming large is a transatlantic crime ring. Can this regional approach on migration policy help or hurt the Caribbean? My guest this week is CARICOM's regional crime security expert and program manager, Mr. Sherwin Toyne-Stephenson. Sherwin Toyne-Stephenson, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Good day. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
You and your team have been crafting a regional approach to migration policy. Comes at a very interesting time for the Caribbean region. Some might even say critical. But given the challenges that we have seen the Caribbean nations, several Caribbean nations facing in terms of migration, some of it being illegal. We look at Venezuela, what is happening there, and its impact on Trinidad and Tobago and parts of Guyana. We look at Haiti and its ripple effects on Caribbean nations. This regional approach to migration policy has to be a complex undertaking. Am I right?
Most certainly it is, because when we think about movement, generally persons consider just the movement that we do, and as you mentioned, the concerns and the challenges with safe and secure movement. But people move all the time. We move for educational purposes, we move for labor, we move for intergenerational meetings, we move. If you have a conversation with any West Indian or any Caribbean person, you would recognize that somewhere in their background, they may have had families from other islands. So the Caribbean is one place where we continue to move. And of course, there are a lot of opportunities involved in persons being able to move from place to place. And this is what we are trying to capture, while minimizing the challenges.
I absolutely agree with you. There are many positive fronts that we can talk about, and we will talk about in this interview when it comes to free movement across the Caribbean region. You mentioned education. Businesses are also expanding and opening up in other Caribbean territories, but I do want to touch on the very critical point that we've seen this transatlantic crime ring. We've seen the challenges of transatlantic crime and its impact. You were here, I believe, at the CARICOM Crime Symposium just over a year ago, right here in Port of Spain, when we dealt with all of the issues facing crime and security across the Caribbean region. Now, with free movement comes a free movement not just for you and I, but for all those people who do not wish to do positive things around the Caribbean region. How does the policy look at those individuals and guard against those individuals traveling across the different islands and spreading negative criminal acts across the region, something that we've been grappling with over the last few years in the Caribbean region?
Okay, as a region, we've done quite a lot of work even before the policy in terms of the rule of law and securing our borders. So this is one of the areas that we are entirely very, very strong in. We've got our CARICOM Implementing Agency for Crime and Security, CARICOM Impacts, which has been working with the region in terms of coordinating conversations, coordinating memorandums of understanding between third states, looking at how do we share security, how do we share data, how do we share information with regard to these persons. You may or not know there's a program we have called the Advanced Passenger Information System, which allows persons to be able to, that is at the member state level, to be able to flag those sensitive persons who are moving so that member states have advance notice. We have very well developed border security systems and protocols which are already in place. This policy is going to be able to strengthen those things when we even look at where the gaps currently exist and what legislative challenges need to be put in to ensure that this is tightened even further.
The Regional Attorneys General at last year's CARICOM Crime Symposium agreed to not only meet but to also craft a collective plan for regional security. Is there any update you can give us to where that plan is at?
Well, what happened in terms of there is a regional plan called the CARICOM Crime and Security Strategy. And this keeps getting updated from time to time. It's based on probability and impact. And there are 14 goals stated, and I won't go into all of them, but this is already there. The attorneys general met specifically with looking at ensuring that the cricket World Cup that we had recently was even more secure. And of course, this came and went without incident. There was a lot of work behind the scenes, and we congratulate all those in the security clusters, those institutions of CARICOM that were able to come to the front and be able to support the attorneys general in ensuring that the region was safe and continues to be safe. There are
Mr. Toyne-Stephenson, and I'm sorry to cut you in, but I just wonder, given that just over a year ago we had this CARICOM Crime Symposium hosted in Port of Spain for the benefit of all the Caribbean region, and since then the statistics have shown, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but in places like St. Lucia, Barbados, the news hasn't even gotten better there as well when it comes to crime. How concerning is it that we've had this regional crime symposium and we haven't been able to reverse the trend of crime? In fact, it's gotten worse in some parts of the region.
Okay, so the symposium was focused on strengthening the approach that we took from a public health perspective. There are lots of work that has been done prior to this, and crime is not something that goes away overnight, unfortunately. And we would all like to wave a magic wand and it disappears. But there are a lot of consequences. There are a lot of what we call root causes to crime that the symposium sought to address in particular. We have been making waves in terms of what we call the demand. And of course, we now looking at how to deal with the supply. Firearms, which is one of the main scourge, resulting in the kinds of statistics that we're seeing, has been targeted. And there's a lot of work going on in that area, again, through our implementing agency for crime and security, as well as consultations that are currently ongoing with member states surrounding their priorities coming out of the regional symposium. We hope to be able to establish those priorities moving forward. Crime is not something that can be addressed singularly. The symposium itself stressed an intersectoral approach to dealing with crime, and we're currently putting the systems in place to ensure that this happens. This doesn't mean that member states have not done anything about crime, but we're just trying to improve as we go along.
Let's talk a little bit about the regional approach to migration policy. What can we expect in this policy?
Okay, so the policy looks at three broad thematic areas, which encompasses most of the sub-thematic areas underneath migration. This would be border protection and intelligence, human and social development, as well as climate change and migration due to hurricanes and displacement. Those
border protection. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about border protection. Something that you yourself have admitted in this interview is the Caribbean has some way to go still in protecting its borders, its island borders. Are we any better off now than a few years ago in terms of protecting our borders? Because certainly the transatlantic crime ring continues to infiltrate within our region. There are illegal guns and ammunition that are entering, but many of them through legal ports of entry as well.
Okay, so again, what we need to understand is that the transnational organized criminal organizations are not static. They're a business. They plan as we go. So every time they are thwarted, they don't just sit. They continue to plan, and we just need to continue to plan better than they have. So it's an ongoing conversation, an ongoing battle, if you want. But crime is something that requires constant attention. The gains that we made a few years ago, we can't just sit still and be comfortable with those, but we need to continue to and engage what the systems that we need to engage to ensure that we stay on top of our game.
Coming up next, beyond the concerns of crime.
Movement itself is much broader and requires a much broader treatment if we are to be able to evolve as a society.
So in terms of border protection within this policy framework, can you give us an idea of what has been said by the stakeholders that should be included in this policy when it comes to border protection?
Okay, so the focus that we're taking currently is through some consultations again that we've had with member states. We've developed a framework which is going to be a toolkit that looks at those areas that member states themselves has identified as priorities. This is, of course, going to be shared with member states and validated at a high-level dialogue in November this year. So it would be preemptive of me to discuss what is in there without the kinds of validation that member states need to take into consideration. Just know that it is a very comprehensive look at what exists. And as I was saying earlier on, it focuses on the gaps because we already have a very robust system.
The United States has declared publicly and has helped at many instances in the transatlantic crime ring that I've been talking about, and as you mentioned, transnational as well. Let's not just do it limited to the Atlantic region. What role does the United States play, if any, in both this policy and this border protection part of the policy?
Okay, so the policy framework itself is a regional framework. It does take into consideration other actors, but it's primarily being built from what we consider to be our priorities, and then it will be, and we'll be engaging other ones. There is going to be some protocols in there looking in terms of how we connect with other states. What are some of the memorandums of understanding that we need to reestablish? And a prime example is that of deportees. How do we engage and ensure that that system is very fair and is well managed? So the policy itself is internal, and the United States or any other international body or organization really does not factor into it, save an effect from where we would be engaging with them. So this is ours.
Mr. Toyne-Stephenson, people of the Caribbean watching this interview will probably be asking, why should they have confidence in this policy, given that just a couple of years ago, right here within the Caribbean region, a Trinidadian citizen traveled to Barbados legally and was deported back to, or extradited, whichever word you would like to use, back to Trinidad and Tobago. Barbados has since held up its hand and said, we take the blame for it. If it's happening at that level of governance across the Caribbean region, why should people of the Caribbean believe that this policy will be fair to regular citizens of the region?
The policy itself does not just focus on the challenges of moving from place to place. The specific focus of the policy is developmental, which takes into consideration those things that need to be addressed, where we can put systems in place to benefit as much as we can from the movement of persons, to be able to make their stays more comfortable, and at the same time addressing those challenges that you have identified in terms of how they move. So that in is a sense where the policy is going. And I agree with you, it's quite concerning, the security challenges within the region for movement, but we need to understand that movement itself is much broader and requires a much broader treatment if we are to be able to evolve as a society and to be able to take full advantage of the economic opportunities that allow for and through persons moving from place to place.
Absolutely agree with you, 100% agree with you. What I'm getting at, however, is that in the midst of this positive movement that you and your team have been working so hard to achieve over the last few years, you've held a number of public consultations and you've invited CARICOM stakeholders to give their input. In the midst of this, do we risk exacerbating what are micro problems right now for places like Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, St. Lucia, Guyana when it comes to their crime problems, exacerbating it to a wider regional problem that becomes really unmanageable if this policy isn't rolled out properly and has the proper mechanisms in place to deal with the security challenges? And it's not just the illegal importation or exportation of guns and ammunition, but also the illegal smuggling of drugs.
I'm really glad you asked that question. So the policy is not a top-down policy, such as, would have the kinds of effect that you've just been describing. What we have been doing in pulling this entire policy together is going by member state to member state, identifying their gaps, identifying their challenges, and have them indicate to us what their priorities ought to be and where we need to be able to place emphasis to ensure that they move forward in the way that they want to do it. So given the way the policy itself is being developed, I don't see the challenges that you have described being unmanageable. Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the human intelligence and climate change aspects of the policy, which are also both very critical. I mean, I've harped on a little bit about the crime situation. As you would imagine, that's a very serious and perhaps priority number one for many nations across the Caribbean. But human intelligence and climate change are increasingly becoming more and more important. We just saw Hurricane Beryl at the end of August, was it? Or end of July, whichever one it was, but Hurricane Beryl coming very early into the hurricane season. That in itself led to some climate migration, because a lot of Grenadians had to move across to different islands, including Trinidad and Tobago. That is something that is going to sort of change the landscape of the Caribbean in the coming years if we don't deal with this in the proper way, because if we have another Hurricane Beryl this year and then next year and then the next year after that, you're going to have more and more people having to move around the Caribbean because simply they cannot live in their islands anymore. Am I right?
Okay, so just to coin a phrase, you use human intelligence, but we would rather think about it, we need to engage that as human and social development associated with displacement due to natural phenomena arising out of hurricanes, even volcanic eruptions. So this is very critical. We've, as a region, also a part of the Cartagena-Forte process. And this year, we were in discussion and in caucus with them, looking at what are some of the implications for displacement by those populations that you have just described. So this is a growing category of persons that the migration policy is treating with because there's been increased and even more intensive weather phenomena with respect to hurricanes, but it's also looking in terms of floods, natural disasters within the regions, and hurricanes, so which this region is being to.
I do want to ask you directly, though. Can what we both basically said the same thing, can this radically change the landscape of the Caribbean if we have to continue moving Caribbean islanders out of the places that they live because they simply can't stay there anymore because of the effects of climate change?
So we need to place that into context. And this is where one of the foundations of the development of the policy comes into consideration, which is data. We need to gather the kinds of data and put those systems of data in place to make informed decisions that are empirical in nature. So given what you said, yes, we recognize that anecdotally there's going to be persons moving, but the policy seeks specifically to identify statistically what percentage would be most effective in what areas, and for this we need the kinds of data, and that in itself is going to inform how much and how many people move and what systems are required to be in place for it.
Up next, we dive deeper into the regional approach to migration policy.
It is not a bandage that prescribes everything, but a guide for member states to then adopt to their own peculiar circumstances.
CARICOM heads of government have long touted, both past and present, by the way, have long touted free movement. They again reaffirmed their commitment to free movement in the Caribbean at the CARICOM heads of government meeting last year in Port of Spain. It was in Chaguaramas that the treaty was signed, and ultimately it was echoed there. But there have been challenges down the decades to really achieve true free movement across the Caribbean. What guides you to believe that it can really get over the line this time around and you can achieve exactly what you set out your vision to achieve in this policy?
Okay, so the policy is not focusing specifically on the free movement regime, which is the CSME. It is an overarching policy that takes that into consideration. So for further detailed information on that, we would really need to interrogate the free movement regime with our CSME units in particular. We're working closely with them, but we all need to understand that this is overarching and it takes that into consideration as a component of.
How is it going to impact, though, and I'm just asking as a segue, how is it going to impact things that we've spoken about, like not only crime and security, but businesses and tourism, etc.?
How is what going to impact that?
Yeah, the policy itself. How is it going? Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so the policy, and I'll keep using this phrase over and over again, is developmental in focus. So it looks at those areas that the region as a whole can benefit from the movement of persons. It is not a bandage that prescribes everything, but a guide for member states to then adopt to their own peculiar circumstances and their own priorities as to how much of the framework that they incorporate. So it's like helping setting up a toolkit for being able to establish national policies. So a lot of the how-tos and the nits and those specific stitches is going to come when member states are beginning to develop their own national policies based on the regional framework that we are developing.
I know that you're limited in what you can give us, given that there is a high-level meeting come November to discuss this very policy that you are placing before Caribbean heads of government. But what has the response been like, even if you can tell us what has been some of the feedback that you've gotten from member states?
Okay, so we've been engaging with member states on an individual basis, and the feedback has been very positive so far. We've had very cordial and very frank discussions with member states, and we have gathered a lot of information that we think can be useful. Of course, the way CARICOM works and the way the Secretariat itself works is that once we've gotten all these facts together, we then take this back to member states on an individual basis for them to validate the findings. And once they're okay, and we're in agreement for all that we've discovered and that we've analyzed it properly, then that becomes, public knowledge, and we're able to move forward from that. So the validation process prior to the high-level meeting is critical in ensuring that when we move away from that process, that engagement, that we would have something tangible to again present and recommend that our heads of government look at in 2025.
Yeah, Mr. Toyne-Stephenson, you've also outlined within the three thematic areas of border protection, human and social development, and climate change. One of the things that we always have to talk about when it comes to any migration policy or any free movement, if you want to say that it's under that umbrella, is regional travel, which has continued to be very challenging for the Caribbean. Do you envisage that being a hurdle in everything that you're trying to achieve within this policy framework of migration?
The framework itself is not going to be a all-out panacea for everything, and that we have challenges in the region for. Certainly, when we've pulled the kinds of data that we want to pull together and put those systems into place, it is going to allow the decision makers, particularly those associated with air travel, to make better informed decisions in terms of what needs to go on in terms of interregional transport. There's a lot more involved in interregional transport than the migration policy itself that I am not the expert in, but the framework will provide the kinds of data that will assist in those decision makers making the kinds of information that is going to redound to our lives.
Like I've said before, Mr. Toyne-Stephenson, for decades, this has been in the making, somewhat of it. There's been talk of free movement across the Caribbean region for some time now. Your policy, the policy that you and your team are working on, has been quite, a task for you guys over the last few years. You've held a number of stakeholder meetings as well. How is this going to revolutionize the way, especially the young people of the Caribbean growing up in the region right now, going to revolutionize the Caribbean that they're living in?
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned the young persons, and this is a very positive part of the policy development. We are seeking and in engaging our young persons as main stakeholders, not just asking them questions. So we're going to be moving into a phase where they're going to be part of the planning process, so that we're able to ensure that the policy itself redounds to them. Another important aspect of the policy is that this is not going to be something that is crafted to be sitting on a shelf. There's sustainability considerations built into it. We haven't really discussed it so far, but a lot of the things that would cause a policy itself like this of this nature to be sustained is looking at the skill sets and the skills bank that ought to be coming from in order to have member states and the rest of society sustain the development. So in addition to looking at some of the labor challenges and some of the labor opportunities with education, what is going to be recommended and what is required is that we're going to be able to have a plan for capacity building throughout the region that is going to continue to build on the kind of skills that are required to move the policy forward. It is not an end to a specific means, but it is a process. And what we hope to engage from the policy itself is that it's something that allows member states to be able to grapple with a lot of the emergent issues. Because we'll understand, quite a lot of the challenges that we have today may not exist tomorrow. There are a lot of challenges that did not exist in the past. What the policy seeks to do is to provide a guide, a systematic guide in terms of how do you address those emergent things, and always, again, from a developmental aspect. We're very confident that once we keep the focus on the citizen themselves and how is this going to benefit the normal man in the street, then we are going to remain in the right path.
Mr. Sherwin Toyne-Stephenson, you've taken on a very difficult job. It's a very difficult task, this policy as well, but we do appreciate you coming on to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.